Tonight we have three excellent speakers. We're going to be covering conifers, native pines, and eastern red cedars. My name is Steve Cooper. I'm the alternative host and moderator for this evening's virtual plant clinic. We have with us also Master Gardener Shirley Channing and Carlotta Mulder, who's our Zoom support tonight. Our agenda, we're going to start off with Patrick Shea talking to us tonight about native conifers, specifically pine, fir, and spruce trees. So Patrick, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve. I think if you want to advance the slide. Okay. Okay. Good evening. Welcome to this plant clinic. I'm a Green Spring Master Gardener, and I'm also studying at Virginia Tech down here about plants, and currently doing soils and a class on tree biology. So some of this information I obtained just recently from that tree biology class. So if you would go ahead and advance, Steve. Okay, I just wanted to give you a little general background information on conifers. They fall into the group of plants called gymnosperms, and conifers is an equivalent term to gymnosperms. And they are contrasted with another kind of plant called angiosperms. And in the course of evolution, the first plants that came along were gymnosperms. That was about 360 million years ago. And the angiosperms started about 125 million years ago. So gymnosperms, which is where the conifers fall into, are about twice as old as angiosperms. So what's the difference between those two groups? The gymnosperms are considered a little more primitive. Gymnosperm means is in Greek means naked seed, and their seeds are exposed on the, their eggs are exposed on the cones, and they are wind pollinated, as opposed to angiosperms, which have the ovule inside the female part of the flower, and they are usually pollinated by insects, although they can also be pollinated by wind. So basically naked seeds versus eggs that are inside an enclosure and more protected. So angiosperms are also the flowering plants. That's another big aspect of those. They're called also evergreens. However, there's a slight twist on that, which is that many of them drop their needles in the fall. So if you see them now or in the next month or so dropping needles, that's totally natural and not a problem. And some of them actually drop all of their needles, such as larch and bald cypress. So the species I was talking about tonight are pines, spruce, and firs, and specifically how to tell the difference between them. And if you would go to the next slide, please. Okay, one way to ID the difference between pines, spruce, and firs is to look at their needles. Those in the pine group are formed in bundles, and the number of needles in the bundle can tell you how many, or tell you which species that is. So Virginia pine has 2, and you can see the list here, loblolly 3, and eastern white pine are 5. And at the base of this is sort of a brown papery wrapping called a fascicle. Actually, the entire group is sometimes called a fascicle. One thing to keep in mind is that the leaf or the needle is the same as a leaf, and we'll see that coming up. It does the same thing as a flat leaf on like an oak tree or any deciduous, leafed trees. Okay, so if you see a group of needles, you can pretty much say that's a pine tree. On the other hand, a spruce tree has shorter needles, and there's an attachment at the base of the needle to the stem, and it's described as peg-like. And if for some reason the needle falls off, that attachment, that peg-like attachment, is retained. So the twig or branch, or where it was attached after it's lost, will be rough, and that's different from the firs, which also have that attachment. But when the needle goes, the attachment goes, and so you get a smooth surface on a fir twig. Next slide. So this is probably more information than you want, but again, this is from my class, and I thought it was very interesting to see that a needle has many of the same features that a regular leaf has. And some of the things in here that I think are really interesting are the stoma, which are like the are pores that allow gas exchange into the leaf, and the leaf can close them or open them. The needle can open and close them. The shape of this one is triangular, and if you have a needle that is triangular, it's going to be a pine leaf. And let's see what else is interesting here. There is phloem and xylem. The phloem is where the sugars that are produced, it's the plumbing for the sugars. It's moving that around the plant. And the xylem is usually for water. And unlike deciduous leaves, this has a resin duct. So, of course, these are evergreen, and they have a waxy cuticle on the outside of the needle to protect it during harsh weather. So if we go to the next one, and here are some spruce needles. They're flatter. The one up in the left is a Virginia native spruce, which is red spruce. So again, you can see in the center of these, you have the xylem and phloem, the plumbing of the needle, which extends into the branch and into the trunk of the tree. And the sugars can actually be transported down to the roots. And also, the xylem can be used for transpiration, which is movement of water from the roots up to the stoma, those gas exchange locations, and out into the atmosphere. And the conifers, just like any other plant, they use that to cool themselves. When the water vapor comes out of their leaves or needles, it cools the plant. So I could say more about that, but I'll leave that at that. Next slide. Another way to tell the difference between the pines, spruces, and firs is by the cones. And again, these are referred to as conifers, which means that it has a cone. And most of the pines, the cone can mature in one season. I'm sorry, except for the pines, they mature in one season. The pines require 2 seasons, which is actually similar to red oaks, which also take about 1.5 seasons to mature. Well, the seeds of red oak, the acorns. The pines, the cones point up when they're young, and when they mature, they shift and they point downwards. Same thing with spruces, and with firs, they stay pointed up throughout their life. So next slide. And a few of the native pines, or I'm sorry, native conifers are, for pines, it's the eastern white pine, the Virginia pine, loblolly pine, and the nursery industry has brought in many exotics such as mugo and Scotch pine. I could only find one native spruce, which is a red spruce, and also a native fir, which is the Fraser. And they like, as you can see, very high elevations. Mount Rogers is about 2 hours further south from where I'm at in Blacksburg right now. And that's a location where Fraser firs will be found in Virginia. So I think that's about all I have.
So now I'll just turn it over to Nancy Miller, who will talk about native pine trees.
Well, all conifers, as we've learned, are gymnosperms, but pines are the largest genus within that phylum. It's 100 of the 600 species in the entire group. And all conifers produce cones, but that doesn't make them pines. Next slide, please. Pines have needles that grow in clusters of 2, 3, or 5, just as we've learned. And they bear true pine cones with scales around a center stalk. And you can use the pattern of these scales to help identify the species of pine. Next slide, please. Now, you can see the 4 native pines of Virginia. From left to right is Pinus echinata, the shortleaf pine. And I've got 2 or 3 of these still standing in my yard. Next is Pinus rigida, the pitch pine. Then Pinus toyata, or the loblolly pine, which I find very difficult to say distinctly. And then Pinus Virginiana, the scrub pine. Next slide, please. Steve, there we go. Pinus echinata, or shortleaf pine, You can see from the leaves, it can grow 50 to 130 feet tall. It has a pyramidal shape at the top with short spreading branches. We also call it the rosemary pine or the yellow pine. And if you notice on the left, the leaves are green, slender, flexible, about 5 inches long, and they can grow in clusters of 2 or 3. It begins to drop needles at the end of its 2nd season, but some of these needles remain until the 5th season, so they're never all gone at the same time. And the next one, you can see the flowers, the pale purple, the long ones. I think it's hard to tell the color. The long ones are the male flowers, and the round ones are the pink female flowers, although they really don't look pink. And the cones will appear in March and April. The bark is distinctive too. It tends to grow in sun or part shade in forests, old fields, and rocky woodlands in moist or dry soils. It has high flammability. You really shouldn't plant it next to your house. You can see its distribution is pretty much from Virginia over to Louisiana. It's throughout the Southeast. It is the most wide.
I can't see the map very good. Does it include all of Virginia or just part of Virginia?
All of Virginia.
Oh, okay.
All of Virginia. It does not include Florida. I think a lot of these pines are moving farther north, frankly, but the literature is not yet reflecting that. It is the most widely distributed of the southern yellow pines. It's native in 21 southeastern states. It provides cover and nesting sites and seeds for small mammals and birds, and it attracts butterflies. It is the larval host of the elfin butterfly. If healthy and well maintained, these trees have few pests. Pine needles and weevils are potential visitors, and these trees are susceptible to wind damage. Its deep taproot makes transplanting difficult, but I suppose it might make it good for a steep slope if you can get it started and get it to hold on. It is resistant to deer damage. Next slide, please. Pinus rigida, or pitch pine, is also known as hard or torch pine. The trunk has a diameter of 1 to 2 feet, and you can tell it because it gets thick, gnarled branches that start to droop as it ages. I guess a lot like people. Its needles are stiff yellow-gray, turning a dark green. They grow in clusters of 3, and as we heard earlier, they have many thin white lines of stomata, so they're more obvious on this one than on a lot of pines. Both male and female flowers are present. You can see the long ones are the male, the shorter reddish ones are the female. It has a very distinctive cone, light brown, appears in whorls of 3 to 5, 1 to 3 inches long. The spines on each scale are stiff and curved and come out in September and October. The cones stay attached to the tree for several years, up to 3. It's usually found on hills as high as 4,500 feet, so not quite as high as the others that we've been hearing about, but still on the slopes. You can see from the map, it's more to the west of Virginia, more in the Piedmont and mountain region. It does best in full sun with moist, well-drained soil, but tolerates poor, dry, rocky soil too. The next slide is interesting, I think, since we're not all taking plant biology. On the left, you can see the remnants of the male pollen cones. See it right at the twig tip? It has scaly reddish brown bark that eventually turns black. You can see that on the right with those strange raised things those are perfectly natural. And then in the middle, it sprouts leaves, needles, and short stems just directly from the bark. They don't do anything or go anywhere. They're just there. I thought that was kind of interesting. It's salt tolerant, resists deer damage, but is susceptible, as all pines are, to wind damage. It is heat and drought tolerant. Although it can be damaged by fire, it will sprout from its roots and stumps. Pitch pine supports the imperial moth larvae. And in the Appalachians, wild boar eat the bark and soft outside wood of the roots, which I don't think is a plus, but maybe hunters would. Next slide, please. Pinus toyata, the loblolly pine, is also called the bull, oldfield, or North Carolina pine. It can grow up to 90 feet tall. It develops a dense oval crown as it ages, and it loses its lower branches. Its leaves have 5 to 8 inch long, slender needles in clusters of 3. Can you see how long they are next to a pin? Much longer than the others. They have 1 inch long sheaths or fascicles and are clustered on dwarf shoots. These only last 3 years, so these are a little shorter than some of them. A shorter lifespan for the needles than some of them. Once again, the male flower is the tall one in the center, and it's surrounded by sort of banana-shaped female flowers. The fruit is stalkless, meaning that it grows directly off the branch. It's ovoid to cylindrical, 3 to 6 inches long. They appear in groups of 3. They have sharply spined scales, which you can see from there, very prickly. And they appear in groups of 1 to 3 in October and November. They release their seeds in the fall through the winter, then stay on the tree at least a year before falling. Smaller pollen cones are yellow-green and show in groups of 6 to 12. And you can see this one is really distributed more along the coast, not in Florida, but it even continues into East Texas. Loblollies are good for fast screening when young, and are easily transplanted from containers. However, it also has a high flame content rating. They have good wildlife value. They provide winter cover for small mammals and birds, support the imperial moth larvae, and the eastern pine elephant. Squirrels and birds eat the seeds, and the pines are moderately resistant to deer damage. Next slide, please. Steve? This one I think is cool. It shows the bark of the loblolly on the left. Can you see? It looks like a fake tree, almost like someone has attached blocks of bark to this tree trunk. But that's what a mature loblolly looks like. And then the leaves or needles are very similar on the loblolly and the pitch pine, but look how differently they're attached. I found that fascinating. I wish that I could remember enough of this to just go out in the wild and identify all these pines. So next slide, please.
Nancy, before we go to the next slide, why on the picture of bark is the pine cone?
They're trying.
I'm sorry, someone else was thinking that.
Yes, most of these pictures are from educational sites, usually Virginia Tech, because They're really interested in trees. And they're trying to show the relative size. Like
Oh,
that's a standard size pen. And they're showing the size of the pine cone relative to those chunks of bark. Can you see it? I mean, those are big chunks of bark. They don't, first off, it's very furrowed. It's hard to see in this picture, but if you look to the right of the pine cone, you can see there's deep fissures between the chunks of bark, which helps slow the water when it rains. It helps it move more slowly to the ground. But they're trying to show relative size. These others, the two pictures of the needles are very close up. They used a special lens to get that. But you can see the fascicles on the loblolly. See how long they are? They're about 1 inch long. The brown part right off the stem before the leaves turn green. Those are fascicles. And they do stay. They're also present on the pitch pine, but not nearly, the angle is wrong to see them, and they're not nearly so long as they are on the loblolly. Okay, Pinus virginiana is the scrub pine. It's also called spruce or Virginia pine. This one is commonly found at high elevations in the Piedmont and mountain regions, and you can tell that from the map. It also does not go as far west. It kind of stops there in Georgia, maybe going into Alabama. And it's also unusual in that it tends to grow in pure stands rather than mixed groups with other trees. It grows in eroded, dry, or clay soil, but prefers full sun, well-drained soil, and sandy, acidic loam, which is, I think, why it does probably well in Virginia. It's small compared to other relative native pines. It's moderately tolerant of pollution. It's about 40 feet tall and has a trunk diameter of about 14 inches. When it ages, it gets flat-topped and horizontal. It has no prominent central leader. The irregular branches often stay attached to the tree even after the branch has died. Dead, angled upward stubs are almost always present along the trunk. And if you drive out along 66, you'll see them. These are the easiest to spot because they've got those dead branches clinging to them. They do come down, however. I've had them come down. Leaves are clustered on dwarf fascicles in twos, 1.5 to 3 inches long. They are twisting, stout, minutely toothed, and yellowish green to dark green. And you can see how differently they attach from the other two that we just looked at up close. These go all the way around the branch. They're not in a flat attachment. Scrub pines, male pollen cones and females bloom from March to May, cylindrical and yellow. And you can see to the left, the male one, and the females are much more numerous and clustered around. Scrub pines are susceptible to pitch canker and have numerous pest and disease problems. They are also susceptible to wind damage, but resistant to deer damage. They are host to the imperial moth's larvae, and its seeds are eaten by birds. So the next slide, please. If you'd like to learn more about these native Virginia pines, there are some sources to start with. We've got 2 pages of sources. I could not find, although I looked because I'd love to have any really small pines that are native to Virginia. I mean, 40 feet is not particularly small.
Just to Caitlyn, who will lead us through the story of the Eastern Red Cedar. Caitlyn?
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks, Steve, for that introduction. As you said, I'm here to talk about another native conifer, commonly known as Eastern Red Cedar. and its Latin name is Juniperous Virginiana. It's one that you are probably seen even if you haven't clocked it, but it's very common in our area. Next slide, please. So one kind of major note before I get started, Eastern red cedars are not actually cedars, they're junipers. So as the Latin name spells out, juniperous, it's in the juniper family. It isn't a cedar at all, but as I go through these photos, I think you'll see why that might be mischaracterized as a cedar sometimes. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is one of our native conifers. It's also native to Canada, in Ontario and Quebec. In the US, it's the most widespread conifer. And you'll see from this map, its ranges in the eastern United States through some of the Midwest, and it's even been naturalized in Colorado and Oregon. This is native, to our region, so specifically to Maryland and Virginia. It's a very common tree here. And depending on how happy they are in their setting, they can grow to be quite large, anywhere from 30 to 65 feet, sometimes even taller than that, with a spread of 8 to 25 feet. This is a really adaptable tree. It has excellent drought resistance and tolerance. So, the reason you see it everywhere is because it can grow happily pretty much anywhere. Next slide, please. So the bark of an eastern red cedar is reddish brown. It's flaky. And when it's mature like this, it almost looks like you can peel it off in strips. This is the case for mature trees, like the one in this photo. But juvenile trees, like we might see, scattered in our yards and gardens, are a little scalier. They kind of have flaky bark. They don't have those characteristic long strips. And there are some differences between the juvenile and mature foliage too, which I'll cover in my next slide. And I'm sorry, before I go on, I should go back to that previous slide. My apologies, I'm talking too fast. But this tree, the wood is fragrant, similar to cedar. It's resistant to rot, it repels moths. And this was a fun fact that I learned in my research for this presentation. It is the most common wood used for making pencils, although they aren't doing that as often because it's not as widely available. So I'm sorry, now I'm ready for my next slide. My apologies. So like I said, many of us have seen volunteer eastern red cedars coming up in our lawns and gardens. At least I have in my yard. I don't know if I have a particularly high quantity of birds or what, but I see little baby red cedars popping up everywhere. At the top left of this slide, you'll see a photo of a juvenile eastern red cedar. So you can see it has spiky needle-like leaves that are kind of bristly and prickly. These are typical on juvenile trees that are less than 3 years old. So once the tree starts to mature, they have these compressed scale-like leaves that you see in the bottom right photo. And I think this is where they typically get compared to cedars because they have that flat, scaly look similar to cedar trees. Next slide, please. So eastern red cedars have separate male and female plants. So male plants have pollen cones that are about 2 to 3 millimeters long. They're not huge, 1.5 millimeters wide, and they shed their pollen in late winter or early spring. And then the seed cones on female plants are probably what we think of as distinctive for these juniper bushes and trees. They are 3 to 7 millimeters wide. They look like fruit, they look like berries, and have distinctive dark blue coloring with kind of that white waxy cover that you can rub off. Each seed cone has 1 to 3 seeds, which mature, about 6 to 8 months after they've been pollinated. Next slide, please. So anytime I cover trees in any of these tree clinics, or I'm sorry, plant clinics, I like to refer to the Virginia Big Tree Program. I learned about this year. It is coordinated by the Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation at Virginia Tech. And they have this really cool registry of the biggest trees in each species in the state. So of course, as I was doing research for this presentation, I went straight there. This is Virginia's state champion tree. In the Big Tree Project, they also characterize or keep track of which are national champions. Unfortunately, we don't have the national Eastern Red Cedar champion, but we do have our state champion, which is shown in this photo. So this, when they wrapped the tape around both of these stems, this had kind of a long entry because apparently the stems have split and they negotiated back and forth about whether it would still count as one tree, but it is 4.5 feet around, or 242 inches, and that's how they score. They have a scoring rubric, and depending on how big the circumference is and how tall the tree is, that's how it works out to have its score. So the height is between 130, or each stem height was 132. I think I have my statistics wrong. Anyway, so the height of this tree was 60 feet. The crown is 57 feet wide, and it came in at 297 points. And I just wanted to share these comments with you because I thought they were really interesting. Like I said, they were having some debate about whether or not this is a tree from a single seed and whether or not the stems are the same plant or not. And ultimately they decided that it counted as one tree and it's going to be the state champion. Next slide, please. So like I said, the Eastern Red Cedar is a very adaptable plant. It's happy, it sprouts on its own, but it does have a couple of problems that it's susceptible to. Bagworms, if you've ever seen a bagworm, they kind of they have little conical nests that they lay in trees. It's also susceptible to mites. And probably what you're most familiar with, if you've spent any time looking at these red cedars, are these cedar rust fungus capsules that grow on them. And they look like, you can't help but notice them because they look like alien growths, but they generally don't cause any harm to the tree. But if you have apple trees or crab apples growing in your yard that you really want to keep healthy, this disease can often contaminate those trees and cause lots of issues with your apple trees. So you shouldn't grow them side by side. Next slide.
Caitlyn, a quick question on the cedar rust. Can you give us some sense of how big that they're
about kind of a quarter size, $1.25 to $1.50.
Is there anything to be done about it?
You can pick them off if you want. I can research the treatments. I generally, since we're talking about native trees and the value to our native ecosystems, don't advocate for chemical controls. Of course, like I said, if you have apple trees that you really treasure in your yard and you have a juniper growing nearby, you see one of these on it, that's going to be a red flag. You don't want those two things coexisting. But I kind of like to take pictures of them and let them live. And if you start to see more systemic issues with your tree, then consider chemical controls. But otherwise, it's part of the ecosystem. Live and let live.
Yeah, Caitlyn, when I have the same problem, the cedar apple rust on some of my Eastern Red Cedar, and before these orange Methuselah-looking things come out in the springtime, they're just like a brown ball, kind of hanging there. And I was taking a sharp knife, just cutting them in half and pulling them off, so no chemicals. And I'm with you on that. I think that's a great approach to take, but you can cut them off. In my case, there were so many of them that it was, and this wasn't a big cedar. I guess it's like any pest. If you can get it when it's young, or not young, but when there's fewer of them before they multiply, it's easier to control them. But again, I just cut them in half with a sharp knife, and they split in half, and you pull them off. And otherwise, if you try to pull them off without cutting them up, they'll damage the branch that they're attached to. So
if you're getting that many, it's an alternative host with anything in the apple family.
Right.
And so I decided that my crab apple was old enough and it could go. It was at the end of its useful life, but they don't want it around apple orchards for sure. because it's so
Yes,
aggressive.
I guess it spends part of its time on junipers and then part of the time on apple trees. So anyway,
Actually, anything in the apple family.
anything in the apple family. Okay.
Okay, yeah, so.
So yeah, like I said, anything in the apple family, this disease affects both trees. It manifests on apple trees and crab apples, anything in that family of trees, as rust, like kind of round rusty spots on the leaves.
Okay.
All right. Next slide. Thank you. So again, we're talking about native trees here, and I always like to talk about the wildlife value of what I'm growing in my yard. And what I hope you're growing in yours. So the juniper seed cones, or I'm sorry, fruit cones, what we know as the berry, provide important winter food for many birds. And they will eat these seeds and distribute them as they're flying over, which is why we all have them growing in our yards everywhere. So I thought this was kind of cool. When cedar waxwings eat these berries, and this was specific to cedar waxwings, but if they consume the seeds and then deposit them as they're traveling through the world, these seeds have a 3 times higher success rate in their germination than seeds not eaten by those birds. So cedar waxwings directly help distribute and germinate these seeds. So many other birds, anything from bluebirds to turkeys and some mammals, also consume these seeds. It provides habitat and nesting sites. When the trees get nice and big, that provides evergreen cover for birds. So these, if you have the space to dedicate to a juniper tree, it's a really great wildlife tree. Next slide, please. So these are my sources that I used. I always love referring to Missouri Botanical Garden because they have a really comprehensive guide to a lot of these plants, and they kind of go through the general details. And then I think this came up in an earlier presentation, but there's an American Conifer Society, which has really detailed, as you would imagine from them as subject matter experts, really detailed articles about various conifers. And then there is, if you want more information about cedar apple rust, I did link to the Forest Service page that kind of outlines some of the issues around that pest.